Asghar, over to you.
Yes. Hi, everyone. It's good to be with you. Let me share with you my screen. Um, so this is um, this work was done started late last year, and it raises a number of questions. Try to answer a number of questions. Um, Basically using economic modeling techniques. And the questions that we're trying to answer is that what if the unemployed in South Africa, or all the adults, or all the population, the South African population, receive a basic income grant? What if the basic income grant pays equivalent to food poverty line, or lower bound poverty line, or upper bound poverty line? And then try to answer, well, who would be the main beneficiary of such a grant, and what would be the impact of such a grant on poverty, inequality, jobs, on household income, economic growth, and government finance. So, as I said, our approach is to translate these questions into basic income grant scenarios, and use an economic model to simulate the economic and development impact of these scenarios over the next 5 years. We have the ADRS, we have built a suite of South African models. We use one of those models, it's called the Dynamically Integrated Micro Simulation Model, DIMSIM. That model integrates an macroeconomic model, econometric model of South Africa, with a household micro simulation model to capture the interaction between the macroeconomic performance and poverty and inequality, welfare of household at individual and household level. Now, the model has a broad heterodox theoretical foundation, in the sense that it is not built based on understanding that the economy left on its own has tendency to full employment of resources and labor that all markets clear. It is not based on that neoclassical or neoliberal, understanding of how market economy work. The heterodox orientation of the model is basically represented in the specification of its equation system that capture the behavior of in the households and private sector in the market economy. It's that the specification of its behavioral basically engine of the model is informed by Keynesian economics, post-Keynesian economics, Marxian economics, Koletsky and post-Keynesian and these schools of thoughts. And then econometric estimations capture those relationships and estimates and establishes a statistically significant relationship for determining how much the private sector investment in the economy, or household consumptions, or prices, or wages, or employment, and a whole range of variables in the economy. On the other side, on the macro simulation part of the model, it captures the government taxations and social security, poverty and inequality. And the model, in terms of, as if you want to show it in the form of a flowchart, it's a replicate. It's tried to be a replicate, like other economic model, replicate of the working of the economy, through that orientation that we talk about as an econometric model. It has more than 3,200 equations that captures that the working of the economy in terms of the estimations and the capturing the behavior, laws of motion of the economy. It has more than about 420 estimated equations that captures basically the behavior of the as I mentioned, private sector, households and variables, whether it is on the demand side of the economy, product consumptions, investments, exports, imports, or output side of the economy, or labor market, or prices and wages, others. And these interlinkages, that estimation process captured the interlinkages between demand, supply, prices, wages, labor market, governments, policies, financial sectors, and others. And that's where these arrows capture that through that specifications and estimation process, the interlinkages are built in the system. And what is also unique about, important about this, is that in addition to the capturing the working of the South African economy, the macro model is also linked to the macro simulation model, which is a different modeling techniques which captures basically it is at the individual and household level. It captures the current policies as it relates to income tax and indirect taxes or social security, demand for social security, cost of social security, poverty and inequality, and feedback its impact on the rest of the economy. So if the economy grows faster, generates more jobs, better jobs, the different types of jobs that are coming, it distributes that among individuals unemployed in the macro simulation part, which changes the income and condition of households and individuals. It changes the tax liabilities and demand for social securities and the poverty and inequality. And then, so we get that heterogeneous impact on individuals and household, and then at aggregate level, it feeds it back into the economy. So you'll see that on the one hand, the macro economy affects macro, and then through these red arrows, you see how the macro, also the welfare of the individual and the households also feed into it. And we chose this model for doing the scenario for a basic income grant because a major appeal of basic income grant internationally is impact on poverty and inequality. So it's not just the macroeconomic impact that we're trying to capture, it's also how does it affect at the end of the day as a social policy, how does it affect households, individuals, and that's why this tool is chosen, as we chose this one to do the scenarios. In order to run the model and see what would be the impact of scenario, we needed to be more specific about the basic income scenarios and the assumptions that we use for running of the model. The first scenario, we run the model for 10 scenarios. And the first scenario is, we call it a baseline scenario, which includes the impact of COVID-19 and assumes that the recent past economic policies will continue as they have been, and without the basic income grant. So we have one scenario that is basically business as usual scenario with no basic income grant, but includes the impact of the COVID-19. Now, there is a report on our website that has the detail on the COVID-19 scenarios, and that if you have a chance, you can look at, and it would be much more detail on these issues. So that's the first scenario, and this allows us to compare the impact of the basic income scenarios to a scenario that without basic income grant scenario. So in terms of the big scenarios, we have 9 scenarios. 3 of them are for unemployment basic income grant, which says, so what if that everyone who is unemployed receive a basic income grant. The eligibility condition for this grant is that one has to be between 18 and 59 years old. It should be, basically defined as broadly unemployed under stats SS definition. The person should not receive any other grant, like disability grant, and should not be in school. And as part of this scenario, all other current grants will continue as they are. And then we run 3 versions of this scenario, and the difference is that they pay it differently. One pays the food equivalent, food poverty line equivalent, the other one lower bound and upper bound poverty line equivalent, different amount. And the amount of the grants adjust annually by inflation. The model is also run with 3 adult scenarios. And here we say, what if all the adults, young and old, receive a basic income grant? In this case, the eligibility will be for anyone who is between 18 and 59 years old, anyone, and then that all other grants also will continue as they are as before. And then we have 3 versions of this in terms of the amount that pays as the other one. And finally, there's 3 scenarios of universal basic income grant, where here it says the entire population of South Africa will be eligible, will receive the grant. Young and old, everyone will receive that. And all current grants except the child support grant will continue as they are. And we have again 3 versions of this scenario based on the amount paid. Now, these were basically the scenarios that we defined in terms of different shades of basic income grant. The other thing that we needed to specify is that we had to look at, as part of the design, we had to specify how it will be paid. Now, we've assumed that this is very important. We have assumed that the main targets of the new grants, these basic income grant scenarios, are individuals and households in the bottom quantiles, the bottom 2 quantiles, and that the top quantiles are expected to bear the overall cost of the new grant. Therefore, the new grant is designed to be as fiscally neutral as possible, which is expected to be achieved through a mix of tax measures: wealth tax, land tax, financial transaction tax, income tax, export tax. We see that a range of different mix of these should be used to, to deal with the, recouping of the spending on the basic income grant. Therefore, for the modeling purpose, the simulations include this specifically: the bottom 2 quantiles, 40% of the households of populations, about 25 million, 24, 25 million, will receive the new grant with no changes to their income and wealth tax liability. In other words, they receive the new grants and they don't have to pay that back. It increases their spending and their disposable income. Individuals from the 3rd quantile, the middle 20%, 11, 12 million, will receive the new grant, will return the equivalent amount to the estate through adjustments of their income and wealth tax liabilities. So the middle quantile pays back what it receives. It doesn't changes the spending power. After tax income remains basically as before. The top 2 quantiles that will receive the new grant will return more than the equivalent amount to the state through adjustments of their income and wealth tax liabilities that we mentioned. The increase in tax liability of top quantiles is designed to help the state recoup not only the amount directly paid to those 2 top quantiles, but also the amount paid to the bottom 2 quantiles. So the top 2 quantiles pays back what it receives, but also pays the state more equivalent to what was paid to the bottom 2 quantiles. And that way, the overall, therefore, what is being spent by the state is being recouped by the state. So overall, the increase in government spending on the new grant is modeled to match the increase in its income and wealth tax revenue. Now, given the close equivalence that I just explained between its scenarios, injection into the household income of the bottom 2 quantiles and leakage from household income of top quantiles, total household disposable income, overall the total aggregate at the economy, when, in other words, disposable income after tax, is not expected to grow that differently across scenarios. So at the same time, the model, the model simulation take into account differences in the consumption behavior of households across quantiles. Therefore, it quantifies the extent to which these differences in terms of who keeps the money and who returns the money, and implication for spending in the economy has some impact on the growth and employment outcome that the model also captured. So given that the propensity to consumption of the bottom quantiles are higher, therefore the money that is kept at the bottom quantile has had some additional dynamics effects as opposed to the money that is being taxed out of the top 2 quantiles. So that is basically these are just what if scenarios. Obviously we could have develop these scenarios to keep more of the money that is spent on the big estate in the economy by households, like for example the middle income, also the middle house, or the middle quintile, also not to pay back, or we can create variation of these scenarios. But in this case, this is how these scenarios have been designed. Before showing you the results, in terms of, it's important what the scenarios pay. It's basically three options for the payments: food poverty line, lower bound poverty line, and upper bound poverty line. The 2020, these are stats essays specifics on this, that for 2020. In terms of going forward, they have been adjusted to average 5%. That's average from the stats essay as well over time. So by 2025, each of these are paying obviously differently. In real term, it's the same, but it's adjusting by inflation of, average of 5%. Now, in terms of the model results, if we run the scenario without the basic income grant, that baseline scenario, what we find is that the model results shows that the economy, obviously, this from 2019, there is a COVID is projected to have multi-year impact, as you can see, drop in the economy and the gradual recovery. And that also importantly, that the economic indicators tend to gravitate towards their past low growth, as you can see, going back to the past trends, and also high unemployment rate. As you can see, by 2025, unemployment rate would be about 28%. Poverty rate would be still 35%, would come down some, but still be high, and the poverty gap remains high. So that would be the situation without the basic income grant. When you add the basic income grant, the results, the difference in the results are, I'm going to go through. The first thing is that in terms of the beneficiary of the basic income grant, depending on the type of grant, the three categories that we talked about, the number of the beneficiaries ranges between 8.5 million. The blue is for 2021, and 2025 is the orange one. About from 8.5 million for unemployment grant to the universal basic income grant, which is 59.5 to 62 million. So hugely different here as the population. So the model takes into account the population growth, the changes in the population, and also the results show that the differences in terms of the shares and who are these beneficiaries across different groups. In terms of impact on poverty, that what you find is that relative to the base scenario, the unemployed basic income grant would potentially lower poverty rate by an additional 6% point over the next 5 years. Here is the base scenario, starting in 2020 of about 39% as poverty line, and then you have a 2020, 2021, and 2025 results. And as you look at the unemployment grant, comparing 2025 to 2025 of the unemployment grant, you see that about 6% lower. And if you use adult basic income grant, the difference would be almost more than half. The unemployment, the poverty line, the poverty rate in 2025, the comparison would be by 13%. As opposed to 29%. And under universal basic income grant, when it pays the upper bound poverty line, the poverty rate would be 0 if we're using the upper bound poverty line. So it ranges, therefore the adult basic income grant will be even more effective in reducing poverty, and the universal basic income grant can potentially eradicate income poverty in South Africa if the grant amount is set to upper bound poverty line. And there are also beneficiaries differences in terms of different groups benefiting from this, impact on poverty rate. So it has a huge significant impact on poverty rate. We quantify that impact in terms of impact on the depth of poverty measured by poverty gap. Again, it is a significant basic income grant will significantly reduce the poverty gap, and depending on the scenario, the poverty gap is projected to decline between 38% to 100%. Again, if it's a universal basic income grant paying upper bound poverty line, it is basically eradicate the poverty gap. So the base scenario, this would be the scenario without the basic income grant, and these are the unemployment grant, adult basic income grant, and universal basic. And you see how the depth of poverty also significantly can potentially decline as a result of these scenarios. Inequality measured by income, by the Gini coefficient, also relative to base scenario, and overall economic policy that includes a basic income grant will be slightly, somewhere between 1% and 2%, or significantly between 3 to 10% more effective in reducing income inequality over the next 5 years. And overall, since the focus of the basic income grant is on benefiting the bottom quintile, the scenarios with higher grant amount will be much more effective in reducing income inequality. That's also in terms of income inequality. In terms of its impact, fiscal impact of these scenarios, so it clearly has a poverty impact positive in terms of reducing poverty rate, poverty gap, and inequality. Now, in terms of fiscal impact, the requirement that the government annual spending on a basic income grant scenario be fully recouped through corresponding increase in income and tax, wealth tax of the top two quintile translates to concurrent increases of both expenditure GDP and revenue GDP, and therefore no deterioration of deficit GDP ratio or debt GDP ratio. So what I'm saying is that if you look at this column here is a new grant program. This basic income grant costs basically, depending on the scenario, between 70 billion and all the way to 1 trillion rand a year on average over the next, depending on the scenario, over the next 5 years. Now, this increase, this amount, when you look at it from the, while that increases government spending as a result of by this amount, depending on the scenario, government taxes on income and wealth, also the money that has been spent is also being recouped in terms of, it shows up as the income, and that it also goes up as a result of that by in each scenario. The more you spend, the more, depending on the scenario, the more recouping you're getting it back from your tax system. And as a result, what you have is that in terms of expenditure GDP ratio, on the one hand, in the base scenario, you have about 33.8% as your expenditure GDP ratio average over the next 5 years. With the basic income grant, this average in terms of expenditure GDP ratio goes up. This average goes up to all the way to about 45%, depending by universal basic income. Your expenditure GDP ratio goes up, government expenditure GDP. At the same time, the revenue GDP ratio also goes up as it collects, therefore, the money back from 30% to about 45%. The difference between the expenditure GDP ratio and revenue GDP ratio is your deficit GDP ratio. And as a result, you'll see that the deficit GDP ratio is stable, remains stable, and also the debt GDP ratio as a result remains stable. And that's what you see here is the deficit GDP ratio and the GDP ratio. And that's what we're talking about as being a fiscally neutral, in the sense that what is being put in the economy, especially goes to the bottom quintiles, the top quintiles pays back, and therefore it's higher expenditure, but the higher revenue, and it cancels each other out in a way. And in that sense, it becomes fiscally neutral. But in that process, there is a whole range of the beneficiaries. There are beneficiaries in there. If you to capture the macroeconomic impact of it, we need to look at in terms of household income and expenditure side of it. Is very clear that at the bottom two quintiles are the main beneficiary of this, because they receive this additional income without paying back, and the top two quintiles are the ones that are paying back and paying for the bottom two quintiles, and the disposable income reduces. And that is shown here. You can see as disposable income for the overall economy growth of it in terms of the compound annual growth rate does not change significantly over the different scenario, because the injections and leakages are almost the same. But when you zoom on the bottom two quintile, you'll see that the growth of disposable income, the spending power of the bottom quintile almost double depending on the scenario. It all increases significantly, while the top quantiles slightly declines, and the overall would be this picture. So this increase in the spending power of the bottom quantiles helps them come out of poverty, depth of poverty, and also the differential between this is growing, the bottom quantile income growing, the top quantile declining, is also reduces the income inequality, the Gini coefficient that you saw. In terms of the macroeconomic effects of it, also because the bottom quantile has a larger higher marginal propensity to consume, it shows also that even though the requirement that government spending on a new grant be fully recouped means that the scenarios do not provide a new net injection into the economy, the scenarios biased towards the poor households with relatively higher marginal propensity to consume have a positive impact on economic growth and employment. This outcome is especially the case under the universal basic income grant. With that growth also comes some employment increases and decline in unemployment rate. So overall, what we have done is that we've used basically the modeling techniques to design new grant scenarios and to quantify their economic and development impact. We designed a baseline scenario and 9 basic income grant scenarios, simulated their impact over the next 5 years, and compared their results. We showed that the South African government can introduce a basic income grant program that targets both poverty and inequality, and that is concurrently fiscally neutral. And depending on the choice of the scenario and relative to the baseline scenario, a basic income grant program can significantly lower income inequality and eradicate poverty in South Africa. It is undoubtedly a pro-poor social policy program. And even though by design, the scenarios do not provide new injection into the economy, the scenarios biased towards the poor households have positive impact on growth and employment. And finally, the main challenge, which we find is that the main challenge to introducing a basic income grant in South Africa, given the government's antipathy toward debt financing, is whether the state is willing to adopt a set of tax measures, wealth tax, land tax, financial transaction tax, income tax, a combination of these that increases the overall tax liability of the top quantiles. In other words, increase the tax liability of the non-poor that have become richer over the last 25 years in order to recoup the overall cost of the basic income grant program that is designed to benefit the bottom 2 quantile households, in other words, the poor. And that's it. I look forward to your questions and comments and suggestions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Asghar. Yeah, it's open up for engagements and comments. Neil made a very important comment. While Asghar's model is fiscally neutral at an aggregate economy-wide level, it doesn't mean it is economically neutral for all sectors in terms of economic stimulus. Put simply, poor communities spend a lot more on stimulus in local economies will be far higher than in the economy at large. So even at these modest allocations, there is a stimulus thrust that comes through. I think that's the point. I know Duma raised it also in his paper about fiscally neutral not having a stimulatory effect. I don't know if there's any other comments. This is a very, very important democratic systemic reform. It's part of the Climate Justice Charter. It's going to be part of the Climate Justice Deal framework that we're developing. And as you can see, I mean, it really impacts poverty and it impacts even inequality and unemployment to some extent. But it does provide a cushion for the deep, just transition. Comments, questions, anybody? To Asghar? I mean, what does this mean for our welfare system? I mean, okay, Marcus, come in, Marcus, go ahead. Go ahead. Unmute yourself, Marcus.
Hello, Vish, can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I I've been listening from the start and it's been very interesting. So I think it's once again, and I think the point you're making, part of our ongoing discussion across a wide range of interested parties and sectors. What has struck me again is that all these models and suggestions people are making, a lot of these things cannot happen without a mass movement or the other pole, so to say, that will make it possible. This government is not going to implement some of the points, policies, principles that are being suggested. And I think as part of the climate justice campaign movement building is precisely to do that, to build from a ground up movement so that people can, in their own way, communities, unions, youth, including children, can participate in formulating the way forward, because it's really about the alternative society that we would like to build. So I really think, for example, the universal grant, it cannot solve the inequality problem. And I'm not against it, but I really think that we need to begin to develop the new utopia so that we can see where all this fits in. It's only a planned socialist economy, but how do we get there? And I'm not opposed in any way to the strategies that are being adopted, for example, our own, since we are part of the climate justice network. So I really think we need to think much broadly around how do we build the counter power base. Because, and I think Michelle raised a very important point, just how relevant the unions are in this debate. Because people have reduced the working class, a lot of people on the left especially, have reduced the working class to the labor movement, whereas communities are doing a huge amount of work to find the way forward. For example, people emphasize a lot the issue of peace and solidarity and friendship in the community, because nothing can happen without that. But how do you build that? So my point basically is let this program that the Climate Justice Forum has initiated is very important, but it needs ongoing so that more people can participate, whether they come from an degrowth or anti-growth position or what. Thank you very much.
Big thanks, Marcus. That was a great comment. And I agree fully with you. I mean, we're really trying to walk on many legs. We are trying to walk on, well, advance many prongs. And
yes,
ultimately, we're hoping this all adds up to movement building. This is the crucial thing. Any other comments, ideas, responses to Asghar? So Asghar, I mean, I'm hoping that as we journey with you and others, and we put out some kind of climate justice deal out of this dialogue, we can hopefully start developing a climate justice macroeconomic model for South Africa that really is grounded in ecological assumptions and understandings, and that we really start thinking differently about flows of energy and resources, etc., in a way that understands the limits of nature and ecosystems and so on. I don't know if you'd want to take your macroeconomic modeling there, because imagine if we could stand up in society with this kind of modeling underpinning what we are saying around climate jobs, or around public transport systems, or around socially owned renewable energy. I don't know if you have a comment for us on that.
Yes, sure. Thanks very much, and thanks, Marcus. Look, in terms of what you're saying, we already we use this model for this because of the basic income grant, kind of like the tool, kind of was in line with what the purpose of the basic income grant. We have a model of the energy emissions, that also we use, especially a few years back, for the carbon tax proposals of the Treasury and others, and we're busy right now actually putting it on the model also added to our website as for its platform. But I think that that is the more and more, I think everyone is thinking that the scenarios should bring in the into the climate change. We put out I think it's very in terms of, I agree in terms of Marcus was saying, in terms of broader framework. A report that we released February. It's on our website and the resources. It proposes a 6-pillar policy proposal, and this issue of the basic income grant or changing in the social security is part of one of the pillars about social policy reform and social policy, and that includes both the basic income grant, introducing of it. In there, we're proposing adult grant, one of the version of the basic income grant, but also includes expansions of the EPWP gradually to become an employer of last resort for the unskilled, unemployed, and having also the basic income grant as well, expanding that. But that 6-pillar policy proposal framework includes reforms in the macroeconomic policies, reforms in social policy that we talk about, reforms in macroeconomics and industry policy scenarios. It includes scenarios regarding the provincial growth and development scenarios, and these different pillars have been expanded, and the specific policy reforms have been proposed, and then the overall impact have been simulated to see the impact on growth, employment, poverty, inequality, and all those indicators. So I suggest maybe for that broader kind of context and use of modeling technique to answer this larger, broader policy reform that is necessary, that will be one place to look at. In terms of this basic income grant scenario, we intentionally use the fiscally neutral approach as a possibility in order, because of dealing with the current situation, where if the government says that we don't have money, here is still can, what we're saying is that you still can introduce basic income grant. So there's no reason not to seriously consider basic income grant. Yes, if we adopt the different approach to macroeconomic policy, to monetary policy, you can actually inject more in the economy and not recoup it. But even with the conservative policies that are at place, what we're saying here is that, look, you can still maintain that fiscal policy stance. You have a fiscal, but you have to be prepared to step on the toes of those who have become rich and super rich over the last 25 years. You got this scenario says, in that sense, are you prepared to increase the taxes, broad tax of wealth tax, transaction tax, land tax, and others of combination, not just income tax, of the upper income in South Africa, in order to introduce it, to reduce the inequality, the growth in the inequality in the country, and the persistent high poverty. So in a way, it is I think it poses a certain type of challenge to the government that cannot reject that proposal of basic income grant because it is not fiscally possible. We say no, it's possible. It is, but you need to look at the taxations, and you look at the country has become the most unequal country in the world. And are you prepared to do something about that? And the way to do it is obviously, basic income grant would be one major way of doing that, as we can see everybody's terms of impact on poverty and impact on inequality. So in a way, the scenarios can be, as I said, you can have different types, shades of this. We can, of these scenarios. But I think it's important to push that line, at least in my view, of even those who are fiscal hawks, to say, this is not anymore. It's about actually the battling inequality and poverty, and whether this regime in South Africa, this government is prepared to take steps to curb this rising inequality and concentration of wealth and financialization of the economy. So that's a I think that's an angle that this report takes to in terms of the debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asghar. And it's going to definitely be one of the pieces in the climate justice deal.